Ethan Carter was not like most people. From the time he was a child, he knew that fairness mattered more than anything else. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, where life was simple, but not always easy. His parents worked hard to make ends meet, and Ethan learned early on what it meant to struggle. The town had its share of problems. Some families were treated better than others because of their skin color or how much money they had. Ethan saw this happen over and over again, and it made him angry. But instead of letting anger consume him, he decided to do something about it when he got older. School was Ethan's escape. While other kids played outside after class, Ethan stayed inside studying. He loved learning about history, especially stories of people who stood up against injustice. One day, his teacher, Mrs. Peterson, asked the class what they wanted to be when they grew up. Most of the students said things like firefighters or astronauts, but Ethan surprised everyone by saying, "I want to be someone who makes sure the rules are fair for everyone." Mrs. Peterson smiled at him and told him he could do just that, if he worked hard enough. Those words stuck with Ethan for the rest of his life. Years passed, and Ethan kept his promise to himself. After finishing high school, he applied to colleges all over the country. Getting accepted into a good university wasn't easy. He didn't have the same advantages as some of his classmates, but Ethan refused to give up. Finally, he received a letter offering him a scholarship to study law. It was one of the happiest days of his life. For the first time, he felt like he was stepping closer to his dream. College was tough, but Ethan thrived. He spent long nights reading thick books and writing papers about how laws should protect people, not hurt them. His professors noticed his dedication and encouraged him to aim higher. By the time he graduated, Ethan had already decided that he wanted to become a federal prosecutor. This job would allow him to go after the biggest criminals and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. It wasn't going to be an easy path, but Ethan was ready. After passing the bar exam, a test that many people fail multiple times, Ethan moved to Washington, D.C. to start his career. At first, he worked long hours for little pay, assisting senior lawyers with cases. But he didn't mind. Every case he helped with taught him something new, and every victory brought him closer to his goal. Slowly but surely, Ethan climbed the ranks. Within a few years, he became one of the youngest federal prosecutors in the country. People began to notice his talent for arguing cases and his deep understanding of the law. One of the things that set Ethan apart from other lawyers was his passion for civil rights. He believed strongly that everyone deserved equal treatment under the law, no matter who they were or where they came from. This belief guided his work, and soon he earned a reputation for taking on difficult cases involving racism and discrimination. Some of these cases were controversial, and not everyone agreed with him. But Ethan didn't care about popularity. All he cared about was doing what was right. At home, Ethan's wife, Claire, supported him fully. They had met during college and married shortly after graduation. Claire was a teacher, and though her job was very different from Ethan's, she understood the importance of fighting for justice. She admired how committed Ethan was to his work, even when it meant late nights and missed dinners. Still, there were times when Claire worried about him. Being a federal prosecutor wasn't just stressful, it was dangerous. Many of the people Ethan prosecuted were desperate and willing to do whatever it took to avoid punishment. Claire often reminded Ethan to be careful, but he always reassured her that he would be fine. Despite the challenges, Ethan loved his job. There was nothing more satisfying than standing in court and presenting evidence that proved someone guilty of wrongdoing. Each verdict felt like a step toward making the world a better place. And yet, deep down, Ethan knew that not everyone appreciated his efforts. Some people resented him for exposing corruption and holding individuals accountable. These people whispered behind his back, calling him names and spreading lies. But Ethan ignored them. He knew that fear and hatred often came from ignorance, and he refused to let it stop him. As the years went by, Ethan's name became well known in legal circles. Journalists wrote articles about his success, and community leaders praised him for his courage. But fame wasn't something Ethan sought. In fact, he preferred to stay out of the spotlight as much as possible. What mattered most to him was the work itself, the chance to make a difference in people's lives. On the surface, Ethan seemed to have everything: a loving family, a successful career, and the respect of his peers. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Racism and inequality still existed, even in places where people claimed to value diversity. Ethan saw this firsthand in his work. No matter how many victories he achieved, there were always more battles to fight. Sometimes the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Yet Ethan never gave up. He reminded himself daily why he had chosen this path, drawing strength from the memory of his younger self, the boy who dreamed of fairness in a world that so often lacked it. Little did Ethan know, however, that his greatest challenge was yet to come. Despite all his experience and determination, nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. What started as an ordinary evening would change his life, and the lives of those around him, forever. It was a cold, quiet evening when everything changed for Ethan Carter. After spending long hours at the office working on a case, he decided it was time to head home. The streets of Washington, D.C. were unusually empty that night, and Ethan felt grateful for the peace after such a hectic day. He stopped at a gas station near his neighborhood to fill up his car before heading back to Claire. It was a routine stop, something he had done countless times before. That's why he never expected anything unusual to happen. As Ethan stood by his car pumping gas, two police officers approached him from behind. They wore their uniforms proudly, but their expressions were anything but friendly. One of them spoke first, his voice sharp and demanding. "What are you doing here?" he asked, even though it was clear what Ethan was doing. Ethan turned around calmly, trying not to show any sign of alarm. "I'm just filling up my car," he replied politely. "Is there a problem?" The officer narrowed his eyes, ignoring Ethan's question. Instead, he asked another one. "Where'd you get a fancy car like this? You sure it's yours?" His tone was mocking, dripping with suspicion. Ethan frowned, confused by the line of questioning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, showing them his federal prosecutor badge and ID. "I'm Ethan Carter," he said firmly. "I work for the Department of Justice. This is my car." Instead of calming the situation, Ethan's response only seemed to make things worse. The second officer sneered, shaking his head. "Oh, so you're some big-shot lawyer now, huh? Bet you think you're better than us." Ethan took a deep breath, doing his best to stay calm. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate if tempers flared. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said evenly. "I'm just trying to go home to my family." But the officers weren't interested in listening. Their attitude grew more aggressive with every passing second. One of them stepped closer, invading Ethan's personal space. "You know, guys like you always act like you own the place," he said bitterly. "Maybe we should teach you a lesson about respect." Before Ethan could respond, the officer grabbed him roughly by the arm and slammed him against the hood of his car. Pain shot through Ethan's body as the metal pressed hard against his chest. He tried to speak, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, but the words caught in his throat. The second officer joined in, delivering harsh blows to Ethan's ribs and face. Each punch felt like a hammer striking him, leaving him dazed and struggling to breathe. People at the gas station began to notice what was happening. A few customers stepped out of their cars, watching in shock as the two officers continued their brutal assault. Someone finally had the courage to call 911, reporting that a man was being attacked by police. But by the time backup arrived, Ethan was lying unconscious on the ground, his face swollen and bloody. The officers stepped back, trying to compose themselves as other law enforcement vehicles pulled into the parking lot. News of the incident spread quickly. Witnesses who saw what happened began talking to reporters, describing how the officers had targeted Ethan without provocation. Some even recorded parts of the attack on their phones, capturing the violent nature of the assault. When the footage surfaced online, it sparked outrage across the country. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. A respected federal prosecutor, someone whose job was to uphold justice, being beaten by the very people sworn to protect others. Claire heard about the attack while watching the news at home. Her heart sank when she saw Ethan's battered face on the screen. She immediately called the hospital, desperate for information. When she finally reached someone, they told her that Ethan was stable but badly injured. Without wasting a moment, Claire rushed to his side. When she arrived at the hospital, Ethan was still unconscious. Claire sat beside his bed, holding his hand tightly. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the bruises covering his body. How could this have happened? Why would anyone do this to him? Questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers. Only fear and anger. Doctors assured Claire that Ethan would recover physically, though it might take weeks or even months. The emotional scars, however, would likely run much deeper. As Ethan lay in the hospital bed, connected to machines monitoring his vitals, Claire vowed to stand by him no matter what. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she believed in Ethan's strength and determination. Together, they would find a way to fight back. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted for accountability. Protesters gathered outside the gas station where the attack had occurred, holding signs that read, "Justice for Ethan" and "End Police Brutality." Social media platforms lit up with hashtags calling for an investigation into the officers' actions. Politicians weighed in, some condemning the violence while others defended the police, claiming there must be more to the story. Despite the outcry, Ethan's attackers showed no remorse. In fact, they tried to justify their behavior, saying they had acted in self-defense. According to their version of events, Ethan had resisted arrest and posed a threat to their safety. Of course, the video evidence told a completely different story. It clearly showed that Ethan had been cooperative and non-threatening throughout the encounter. Still, the officers clung to their fabricated narrative, hoping it would shield them from consequences. As days passed, Ethan slowly regained consciousness. At first, he was disoriented, unsure of where he was or how he had gotten there. Claire stayed by his side, explaining what had happened and reassuring him that he was safe. When Ethan finally understood the full extent of the attack, he felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and disbelief. He had dedicated his life to serving justice, yet here he was, victimized by the very system he worked within. Ethan's recovery process was slow and painful. Every movement sent waves of discomfort through his body, reminding him of the trauma he had endured. Physical therapy sessions became a regular part of his routine, helping him regain strength and mobility. But the mental toll was harder to address. Nightmares haunted Ethan, replaying the attack over and over again in vivid detail. Sometimes he woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that the officers were standing over him once more. Through it all, Claire remained a constant source of support. She encouraged Ethan to talk about his feelings, knowing that bottling them up wouldn't help. Friends and colleagues visited often, offering words of encouragement and promising to help in any way they could. Even strangers reached out, sending letters and messages of solidarity. Ethan appreciated these gestures, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. He began to wonder if the attack had been random, or if it was retaliation for his work. Over the years, Ethan had prosecuted several high-profile cases involving corrupt officials and abusive police officers. Could this have been an attempt to silence him? The thought frightened him, but it also fueled his resolve. If someone wanted to intimidate him, they had picked the wrong person. Ethan wasn't going to let this break him. Instead, he planned to use his experience to shine a light on the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement and the justice system. While Ethan focused on healing, investigations into the attack continued. Internal reviews were launched to determine whether the officers had violated protocol. However, progress was slow, and many doubted that real accountability would ever come. Whispers of corruption circulated, suggesting that powerful figures within the department were working to protect the officers involved. For Ethan, this possibility was infuriating, but not entirely surprising. He had seen enough during his career to know that change rarely came easily. Despite the setbacks, Ethan refused to give up hope. He believed that truth and justice would prevail, even if it took longer than expected. With Claire by his side, and the support of countless others, he prepared himself for the next chapter of his journey. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Ethan was ready to face them head-on. After all, fighting for fairness was what he did best. As Ethan Carter recovered from the brutal attack, the world around him seemed to grow darker. What should have been a straightforward case of police misconduct turned into something far more complicated. The initial public outcry had been strong. People were outraged by the video footage and demanded justice for Ethan. But as days turned into weeks, things began to shift. Powerful forces within the justice system worked behind the scenes to muddy the waters, making it harder for Ethan to find closure. At first, Ethan believed the investigation into the officer's actions would be fair. After all, there was undeniable evidence showing what had happened. Witnesses had spoken out and videos captured the entire incident on camera. How could anyone deny the truth? But soon cracks began to appear in the process. Internal reviews stalled, and key pieces of evidence mysteriously disappeared. Officers who had initially agreed to testify suddenly changed their stories, claiming they couldn't remember important details. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning the case upside down. Ethan's frustration grew with each passing day. He couldn't understand why the system he had fought so hard to uphold was now failing him. Claire tried her best to keep his spirits up, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers continued to rally around him, offering support and encouragement. Still, the lack of progress weighed heavily on Ethan. He felt powerless, trapped in a situation where the odds were stacked against him. Then came the unexpected blow. One morning, while Ethan was attending physical therapy, Daniel Brooks, a lawyer friend of his, called Claire with alarming news. Someone had leaked information to investigators suggesting financial irregularities in Ethan's past work expenses. At first, Claire thought it must be a mistake. Ethan had always been careful with money, meticulous about following rules and guidelines. But as Daniel explained further, she realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Anonymous tips had led authorities to scrutinize Ethan's records, painting him as corrupt in the eyes of the media. The accusations hit like a punch to the gut. Ethan had spent years building a reputation as a principled prosecutor, yet now he found himself under suspicion. Reporters swarmed outside his house, shoving microphones in his face and asking questions about the alleged embezzlement. Headlines screamed accusations, twisting facts to make Ethan look guilty. Federal prosecutor faces charges, one read. Hero or hypocrite? Asked another. The public, once united in outrage over the attack, became divided. Some still supported Ethan, believing the claims against him were baseless. Others questioned whether he truly deserved sympathy. Claire stood firmly by her husband's side, refusing to let the storm tear them apart. She hired Daniel Brooks to represent Ethan, knowing he was one of the best lawyers in the business. Daniel was straightforward with them from the start. This isn't going to be easy, he warned during their first meeting. They're coming at you hard, Ethan. Whoever's behind this doesn't want you to fight back. Despite the grim outlook, Ethan refused to give up. He knew the charges were false, but proving his innocence wouldn't be simple. Powerful people wanted to silence him, and they weren't playing fair. As Daniel dug deeper into the allegations, he uncovered troubling patterns. The timing of the accusations was suspicious. They had surfaced just as momentum was building for accountability in Ethan's assault case. It seemed clear that someone was using these claims to distract from the real issue and discredit Ethan. While Ethan battled the legal storm, the two officers involved in the attack walked free. Internal investigations cleared them of wrongdoing, citing lack of evidence. This decision shocked many, especially since the video footage clearly showed their violent behavior. Protesters took to the streets again, chanting slogans and holding signs demanding justice. But their voices fell on deaf ears. The message was loud and clear. No matter how much noise people made, the system wasn't going to budge. Ethan watched the protests on TV from his living room, feeling both grateful and helpless. He appreciated the support, but he also knew it wouldn't be enough to change the outcome. His faith in the justice system, once unshakable, began to waver. How could he continue fighting for fairness when the same system failed him so completely? These thoughts haunted him, gnawing at his resolve. Claire noticed the change in Ethan. He became quieter, spending hours staring out the window or reading legal documents late into the night. She worried about him, not just because of the physical pain he was still dealing with, but because of the emotional toll everything was taking. One evening, she sat beside him on the couch and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can't let them win," she said softly. "If you stop fighting, then they've already beaten you." Her words struck a chord. Ethan realized she was right. Giving up wasn't an option. If he stopped now, it would mean letting the attackers, and whoever was protecting them, get away with everything. That thought filled him with anger, but also determination. He might not have control over the investigation or the court proceedings, but he could still speak out. He could still fight for justice, not just for himself, but for others who faced similar struggles. With renewed energy, Ethan began working closely with Daniel to build a defense. They gathered documents, reviewed old cases, and reached out to colleagues who could vouch for Ethan's integrity. Every step forward felt like a small victory, a reminder that hope wasn't lost. Meanwhile, Claire used her own network to spread awareness about Ethan's situation. She spoke to journalists, attended rallies, and shared updates on social media. Together, they created a grassroots movement aimed at keeping pressure on authorities to act fairly. But the road ahead remained uncertain. Prosecutors pushed forward with the embezzlement charges, presenting a distorted version of events that painted Ethan as greedy and dishonest. Witnesses who had previously supported him were intimidated into silence, while others recanted their statements entirely. It was a coordinated effort to destroy Ethan's credibility, and it was working. Public opinion shifted again, with some people dismissing him as just another crooked lawyer getting what he deserved. Through it all, Ethan held on to one thing: the truth. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, and he trusted that, eventually, the truth would come out. In the meantime, he focused on staying strong for Claire, for his supporters, and for himself. He reminded himself daily why he had chosen this path, drawing strength from the memory of his younger self, the boy who dreamed of fairness in a world that so often lacked it. As the trial date approached, tensions ran high. Ethan prepared himself for the worst, knowing that powerful forces were determined to see him convicted. Yet deep down he clung to a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would prevail. And if it didn't, he vowed to keep fighting anyway. Because giving up wasn't an option, not for someone like Ethan Carter. The trial was a spectacle, the kind of event that drew national attention. Reporters crowded the courtroom every day, cameras flashing outside as people waited anxiously for updates. For Ethan Carter, it felt surreal to sit in the defendant's chair after spending so many years on the other side of the law. He had spent his career prosecuting criminals and fighting for justice, but now he was the one being accused of wrongdoing. The irony wasn't lost on him, though there was no time to dwell on it. Every moment in court mattered, and Ethan knew this was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to prove his innocence. From the start, the prosecution came out strong. They painted Ethan as a hypocrite, someone who preached fairness but secretly lined his pockets with taxpayer money. Their case relied heavily on financial records that supposedly showed discrepancies in Ethan's work expenses. Witnesses called by the prosecution testified that they had seen Ethan acting suspiciously, making large withdrawals or using funds for personal purposes. But Ethan recognized something about these testimonies. They didn't match reality. Many of the witnesses seemed nervous, their stories inconsistent and vague. It was clear they were under pressure to say what they were told, not what they truly believed. Ethan's lawyer, Daniel Brooks, worked tirelessly to dismantle the prosecution's arguments. He cross-examined each witness carefully, pointing out contradictions and gaps in their stories. Daniel also presented evidence showing that Ethan had always followed proper procedures when handling money. Bank statements, emails, and official documents all supported Ethan's claim that the allegations were false. Yet, despite Daniel's best efforts, the jury seemed skeptical. The damage done by the media coverage and the smear campaign against Ethan had taken its toll. People were quick to believe the worst, even when facts suggested otherwise. Claire sat in the front row of the courtroom every day, her eyes fixed on Ethan. She could see the exhaustion etched on his face, the strain of weeks spent defending himself against baseless accusations. But she also saw something else, a quiet determination that refused to fade. Even in the darkest moments, Ethan never let himself give up. Claire admired his strength, though her heart ached for him. She wished she could shield him from the pain, but all she could do was sit there and offer silent support. As the trial dragged on, tensions grew. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs and chanting slogans. Some supported Ethan, believing he was innocent and a victim of retaliation. Others sided with the prosecution, convinced that Ethan was guilty. The split in public opinion reflected the larger divide within society, those who trusted the system to deliver justice versus those who saw it as broken beyond repair. Ethan watched the protests on TV during breaks in the trial, feeling both grateful for the support and frustrated by the division. Then came the verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge instructed the jury foreman to read the decision. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Claire clasped her hands tightly together, praying for the best but bracing for the worst. When the words finally came, guilty, it felt like the floor had been ripped out from under them. Ethan stared straight ahead, unable to process what had just happened. How could this be? How could the truth have been ignored so completely? The judge sentenced Ethan to 10 years in prison. 10 years. The number echoed in his mind, unbearable and unfathomable. As deputies led him away in handcuffs, Ethan caught one last glimpse of Claire. Tears streamed down her face, but she managed a small nod, mouthing the words, "Stay strong." That single gesture gave him the courage to keep moving forward, even as despair threatened to overwhelm him. Life in prison was brutal. Ethan had never imagined he would end up behind bars, surrounded by hardened criminals. The environment was harsh, and the days blurred together in a haze of monotony and fear. At first, Ethan struggled to adjust. Simple tasks like eating meals or taking showers became daunting challenges, as he constantly worried about threats from other inmates. Guards treated him coldly, their disdain evident in every interaction. It was a far cry from the life he had known before. But Ethan refused to let the situation break him. He reminded himself daily why he was there, not because he had done anything wrong, but because powerful people wanted to silence him. If he gave up now, they would win. So instead of wallowing in self-pity, Ethan focused on finding ways to make the most of his time. He spent hours reading legal texts borrowed from the prison library, studying cases and strategies that might help overturn his conviction. He wrote letters to anyone who might listen, lawyers, journalists, activists, explaining his story and asking for help, and he connected with other inmates, sharing conversations that revealed the humanity beneath their tough exteriors. One inmate in particular stood out to Ethan. His name was Marcus, a middle-aged man serving time for a robbery he claimed he didn't commit. Marcus reminded Ethan of himself in some ways, determined to prove his innocence, clinging to hope despite overwhelming odds. The two men formed a bond, supporting each other through the darkest moments. Marcus often encouraged Ethan to keep fighting, telling him, "If you stop believing in yourself, then they've already won." Outside the prison walls, Claire continued her fight for justice. She organized rallies, spoke to reporters, and reached out to influential figures who might be able to help. Her efforts kept Ethan's story alive, ensuring that people didn't forget about him. She also stayed in close contact with Daniel, who was working on appeals and gathering new evidence to challenge the verdict. Though progress was slow, Claire refused to give up. She believed in Ethan with every fiber of her being, and she vowed to stand by him until the bitter end. Months passed, and slowly, cracks began to appear in the prosecution's case. A whistleblower came forward, revealing that key pieces of evidence used against Ethan had been fabricated. Internal documents surfaced, exposing how higher-ups in the justice system had orchestrated the smear campaign to protect the officers involved in the attack. These revelations reignited public interest, sparking calls for a retrial. Journalists picked up the story again, highlighting the injustices Ethan had faced and demanding accountability. When the court granted a retrial, Ethan felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. This was his chance to set the record straight, to show the world that he was innocent. Back in the courtroom, Daniel presented the new evidence, dismantling the prosecution's arguments piece by piece. Witnesses admitted under oath that they had been coerced into lying, while experts testified that the financial discrepancies were nothing more than clerical errors blown out of proportion. Finally, after weeks of intense deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers as Ethan sat motionless, overwhelmed by emotion. It was over. He was free. As the judge dismissed the charges, Ethan turned to look at Claire, who was crying tears of joy. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to feel relief. Walking out of the courthouse, Ethan was greeted by a sea of supporters. Strangers hugged him, thanking him for standing up against injustice. Reporters shouted questions, eager to hear his thoughts, but Ethan simply smiled and raised his hand in gratitude. Words couldn't capture what he was feeling in that moment: the weight of everything he had endured, the love and support of those who had stood by him, and the knowledge that the truth had finally prevailed. Yet, even as Ethan celebrated his freedom, he knew the battle wasn't truly over. Racism, corruption, and inequality still existed, poisoning the very foundation of the justice system. What had happened to him was proof of that. But instead of retreating into bitterness, Ethan chose to channel his pain into action. He founded an advocacy group aimed at addressing police misconduct and systemic racism, using his experience to inspire change. Together with Claire, Daniel, Marcus, who was later exonerated, and countless others, Ethan vowed to keep fighting for himself, for his family, and for everyone who deserved fairness in a world that so often lacked it. Ethan's journey had been long and difficult, filled with moments of despair and triumph. But through it all, he had remained steadfast in his belief that justice was worth fighting for. And now, as he looked toward the future, he knew he wouldn't stop until the world became a little bit better, a little bit fairer, for everyone. Ethan Carter's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. After being released from prison, he was finally free to rebuild his life, but the scars of what he had endured ran deep. Physically, he was healing. His bruises had faded, and his strength was returning. Emotionally, however, the wounds were harder to mend. The betrayal by the justice system, the months spent behind bars, and the public scrutiny had left him feeling raw and vulnerable. Yet Ethan refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he chose to focus on the future, determined to turn his pain into purpose. Claire was his rock during this time. She stood by him every step of the way, helping him adjust to life outside of prison. Together, they moved to a quieter neighborhood, hoping to escape the constant attention from reporters and protesters. It wasn't easy starting over, but Claire reminded Ethan that they had each other, and that was enough. Slowly, they began to piece their lives back together, finding comfort in small routines like cooking dinner together or taking long walks in the evenings. These moments of normalcy helped Ethan regain a sense of stability, grounding him as he prepared for the next chapter of his journey. But Ethan knew he couldn't just move on. What had happened to him wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem. Racism, corruption, and abuse of power were deeply rooted in society, and Ethan felt a responsibility to do something about it. He decided to channel his anger and frustration into action, founding an advocacy group called Justice Beyond Bars. The organization aimed to address police misconduct, systemic racism, and inequality within the justice system. Ethan wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had gone through. The early days of building the group were challenging. Ethan worked tirelessly, reaching out to lawyers, activists, and community leaders who shared his vision. He also collaborated with Marcus, the former inmate whose friendship had meant so much to him during his time in prison. Marcus had been exonerated thanks to new evidence uncovered during Ethan's retrial, and he was eager to join the fight for justice. Together, they traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, hosting workshops, and meeting with families affected by similar injustices. One of the first major initiatives of Justice Beyond Bars was creating a database of cases involving police brutality and wrongful convictions. Ethan believed that transparency was key to holding people accountable. By collecting and sharing information, he hoped to expose patterns of misconduct and push for reforms. The project quickly gained traction, attracting support from journalists, academics, and everyday citizens who wanted to make a difference. People began submitting stories and documents, contributing to a growing body of evidence that highlighted the flaws in the system. While Ethan focused on advocacy work, Claire continued her efforts to raise awareness about his story. She gave interviews, wrote articles, and spoke at events, shining a light on the challenges faced by victims of injustice. Her voice became a powerful tool, amplifying Ethan's message and inspiring others to get involved. Together, they formed a partnership that was both personal and professional, a testament to their unwavering commitment to each other and their cause. As the months went by, Ethan's advocacy work began to yield results. Lawmakers took notice of the growing movement and introduced legislation aimed at increasing accountability for law enforcement officers. Some cities implemented reforms, requiring body cameras for all officers and establishing independent review boards to investigate complaints of misconduct. While these changes were small compared to the scale of the problem, they represented progress, and that gave Ethan hope. Still, there were setbacks along the way. Not everyone supported Ethan's efforts. Critics accused him of being anti-police, arguing that his advocacy undermined the hard work of honest officers. Others dismissed him as a disgruntled ex-prosecutor seeking revenge. Ethan didn't let these comments discourage him. He understood that change often came with resistance, and he remained steadfast in his mission. During speeches and interviews, he emphasized that his goal wasn't to vilify law enforcement, but to create a system where everyone was treated fairly. One of the most rewarding aspects of Ethan's work was connecting with others who had experienced similar struggles. Families reached out to him, sharing their stories of loved ones who had been wrongfully convicted or harmed by police violence. Hearing their pain reinforced Ethan's belief that he was doing the right thing. He made it a point to listen to their experiences, offering guidance and support whenever possible. In return, these individuals became some of his strongest allies, joining forces to demand justice and reform. Despite the challenges, Ethan found joy in the work he was doing. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a real difference, not just for himself, but for countless others. His advocacy group grew rapidly, attracting volunteers and donors from all walks of life. Young people inspired by Ethan's resilience joined the movement, bringing fresh energy and ideas. They organized protests, created social media campaigns, and lobbied local governments to implement policy changes. Watching this younger generation take up the mantle filled Ethan with pride and optimism. Yet, even as he celebrated victories, Ethan never forgot the lessons he had learned. He knew that fighting for justice required patience, persistence, and humility. There would always be obstacles, moments when it seemed like nothing would ever change. But Ethan had faith in the power of collective action. He believed that if enough people came together, they could overcome even the toughest challenges. Years passed, and Ethan's influence continued to grow. His story became a symbol of resilience and determination, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Schools invited him to speak to students, teaching them about the importance of fairness and equality. Community centers hosted events in his honor, recognizing his contributions to the fight for civil rights. Though Ethan appreciated the recognition, he never sought fame or glory. All he cared about was making the world a better place. Claire often joked that Ethan had become a different person since starting Justice Beyond Bars. Gone was the quiet, reserved man she had met in college. In his place was a bold, passionate advocate who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. But Claire knew that beneath the surface, Ethan was still the same person, someone who cared deeply about fairness and believed in the goodness of others. That core belief had carried him through the darkest times and continued to guide him forward. Looking back on everything he had been through, Ethan sometimes marveled at how far he had come. From the boy in Ohio who dreamed of fairness to the man standing before crowds of supporters urging them to demand change, he had lived a life full of challenges and triumphs. Each experience had shaped him, teaching him valuable lessons about courage, compassion, and perseverance. On a quiet evening, as Ethan and Claire sat on their porch watching the sunset, Ethan reflected on his journey. "Do you think we're making a difference?" he asked softly. Claire smiled, placing a hand on his knee. "Of course we are," she replied. "Every day, we're planting seeds of change. Maybe we won't see all the fruits of our labor right away, but I know they'll grow." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't need immediate results to know that his work mattered. As long as he kept fighting, kept speaking out, and kept believing in the possibility of a better world, he knew he was on the right path. And so, Ethan Carter continued his mission, driven by the belief that justice was worth every sacrifice. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, he faced it with hope and determination. After all, he had already proven that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth and fairness could shine through, if only people were brave enough to carry the torch. End of Part 5.